I guess it makes sense at the end of the day that the deadly trait would be a standout feature of a game set in the zombie apocalypse. That totally makes sense. Today, I'm going to be doing a follow-up video discussing my experience running Hopefinder on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I'm the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who, true story, actually had to bust out the first aid kit and treat a cut that one of my players got at my Hopefinder game, which means I had to do actual infection control protocol at a zombie apocalypse game. That's what you call thematic storytelling. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. And welcome to my second video on the game Hopefinder, a hack of Pathfinder 2nd Edition from one of the authors of Pathfinder 2e, Jason Bulmahn. Now last month, in honor of Halloween, I covered Jason Bulmann's zombie apocalypse take on the Pathfinder 2e rule system, and you can see that video by following this link up here. In that video, I discussed some of the changes that Jason Bulmahn made to the core Pathfinder 2e rules to create a zombie apocalypse style game that focused not just on the struggle to survive the dangerous elements of the zombie apocalypse, but also on the narrative need for survivors to find their reason to keep moving on, find their hope, if you will. And I discussed some of the thematic things that I really loved about Bulmann's take on this classic role-playing scenario. Now, last month when I chose to cover Hopefinder, there was one caveat to that video in that I had not actually run Hopefinder at that particular point in time. I was preparing to run a few Hopefinder games in the lead up to Halloween, but I hadn't actually played the game yet, and in that video I threw out a question to you, my audience, and asked, would you like to see a follow-up video after I'd had a chance to actively run Hopefinder? Several of you said yes, so that's what this video is going to be. This video is going to build on the content in that first video, so in order for some of the conversations in this video to make sense, you either need to be familiar with the game Hopefinder, or at the very least you need to have watched that previous video that I did. But now that I've had a chance to run 2 different Hopefinder stories in 3 different games across 4 different tables, yes, that will make sense later, I've gotten some experience under my belt, and my time running these Hopefinder one-shots has given me some additional thoughts about what Hopefinder has to offer, so in this video I want to dig into that. My goal is to divide this video into 3 distinct sections. In the first section, I'm going to talk about the Hopefinder one-shots that I created, how I set them up, give you a general idea of who I was running them for. And then in the second section, I want to talk about how the different players at the 4 different tables I did this for, how they reacted to Hopefinder in general. And then finally in the third section, I'm going to dive into some of my observations about Hopefinder that I think are worth acknowledging and discussing for people who might be interested in picking this game up. I will say up front that my experience running Hopefinder was a very positive experience. I enjoyed every single one-shot that I ran. And while I haven't had a chance to do a true Hopefinder campaign yet, I've seen enough that I really think I'm going to try a Hopefinder campaign around Halloween next year, because this is definitely a game where I think there's a lot of good stuff to dive into. Now, the sale that Mini-ttrpg Games had on Hopefinder last month, I do believe that has ended as of the time this video will be going live, but there will still be a link to Mini-ttrpg Games and the rulebooks for Hopefinder that I will have linked in the video description. In order to play Hopefinder, you do need access to the rules for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You either need a Pathfinder 2e rulebook, or you need to have access to Archives of Nethys, but as Archives of Nethys is free, and most of the people who watch this channel have probably played Pathfinder 2e, I don't think that's much of a deterrent if you're interested in trying Hopefinder. All in all, I believe you should be able to pick up PDFs of the Survivor's Guide and the Narrator's Guide for about $20 right now, and truthfully, I had a lot of fun with my games, so I don't think that's too bad of a deal. Naturally, if you have any questions about Hopefinder, or if you've had a chance to play Hopefinder yourself and want to talk about your experiences, I encourage you to jump down to the comments section and leave your thoughts, questions, and observations in the comments section. The best part of this job is getting to interact with you, my audience, so I love to hear what you have to say. And yes, that is my way of transitioning into the do all the YouTube stuff that you hear in every video, like, share, subscribe, check out my free Discord, my Patreon, all of that YouTube stuff. All of that does support the channel and truthfully means so much to me. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk about these stories that I actually ran using the Hopefinder system. I ended up running Hopefinder at 4 different tables over the course of 3 different days, and I actually tried out a couple of different stories in this particular mixture. The 2 stories that I ran were called Class Reunion and Black Friday Specials. Now the setup for Class Reunion is this. In real life, I actually work for a high school, and at that high school, I run a tabletop RPG club. We play Pathfinder a couple of times every month, and my students are absolutely amazing. Well, for Halloween this year, I decided to give them a taste of the spin-off of Pathfinder, Hopefinder, and run a zombie apocalypse game set at our high school. Now, in an effort to give my students the best experience possible, I did a test run of my Class Reunion story at my home gaming table, meaning that ultimately I actually ran Class Reunion 3 times, once for my home gaming group and for 2 different groups at my high school TTRPG club. The story for Class Reunion was relatively simple. These survivors were all former graduates of the high school in question, and they had to go to the high school and get a generator for their compound, but in the process of trying to get that generator, they had to deal with a zombie-infested high school that they had once attended. The highlight of this story that got a lot of fantastic response from everyone who played it was a battle with a leaper zombie, as published in Hopefinder, that had been redesigned just a little bit to be a zombie in the high school mascot outfit. None of my players were expecting zombie mascot, and it was hilarious. I got a ton of great reactions out of that. My students truly loved it. The other game that I ran was called Black Friday Specials, and this was run for a group of gamer friends that I don't see very often, but that I was able to invite out to my house for a spooky-themed gaming session the weekend before Halloween. Now, the Black Friday Specials adventure that I ran for them was a reworked adventure. When Jason Bulmahn did a Kickstarter for a physical version of the Hopefinder game, as part of that Kickstarter, you could pick up an adventure location called Holiday Horror Pinecrest Mall, and I slightly reworked the adventure that Jason Bulmahn created in that pamphlet for my friends who were going to be gaming with me that day. Quite possibly the most interesting aspect of running that second story, Black Friday Specials, was that all of the gamers that were part of that particular story, with the exception of my wife, had not played Pathfinder 2nd Edition before. Now, all of them were experienced gamers. They have played other games, but none of them had ever actually sat down for a Pathfinder 2e game, much less had they sat down for a Hopefinder game. So for that particular story, I actually had 4 different brand new Hopefinder Pathfinder players, and truthfully the experience went really well, which highlights something that I said in my previous video, that I think Hopefinder could actually be a really good introductory RPG for people who might be interested in the hobby, but who don't necessarily have the interest in diving into a game with so much content like Pathfinder 2nd Edition currently has. Honestly, in future releases of Hopefinder, I hope that Jason Bulmahn reworks his product just a little bit to make it a little more accessible to people who are new to the hobby, because honestly my experience running that second story shows that this game can be a great introduction. One of the highlights of Black Friday specials, one of my friends who played in that game actually works as Santa Claus around the holiday season, and one of the creatures that Bulmahn put into that location was a zombie mall Santa, which led to an absolutely amazing brawl between my real-life friend who likes to play Santa Claus and the evil zombie Santa Claus, and it was just a wonderful moment at the gaming table. It was a ton of fun. But all of that leads to the second thing which I'd like to discuss, which is the response that I saw from the different groups that played these Hopefinder stories. As I mentioned, one table is my normal Pathfinder 2e table. Two tables were high school students from my TTRPG club, and then the final table was a table of experienced gamers, but experienced gamers who had never experienced Pathfinder 2e or by extension Hopefinder. In essence, I was working with pretty different tables in every situation, and yet one of the things I can tell you is, across the board, the experience was very positive. When I was running Class Reunion for my home game, and when I was running Black Friday specials for my friends I don't get to see very often, in both of those instances, I was the main storyteller at the table. For my high school TTRPG club, I actually co-storytell with some of the students to give students experience as storytellers, and so I was actually giving them the Class Reunion story and letting them kind of add their own flair to it. But regardless of whether I was telling the story directly, or I was helping some of my students tell the story and seeing how other students responded, genuinely speaking, I got a lot of positive feedback from every single table. Now, as a side note here, I don't want to sound like the stereotypical old man grognard, but I will say both of my high school tables, there was at least one student that actively tried to help the zombies, so I am a little worried about the future of our society. But that being said, my players did genuinely have a good time across the board. When I get into the observations here in a moment, I'll dive into this a little bit deeper, but I will say that there was some definite tension to some of the zombie fights that showed up in each of the games that was run. And I'll talk specifically about how I think that dynamic ends up occurring. But there were definitely instances at every table where one of my players ended up genuinely concerned about how they were going to fare in the face of the zombie apocalypse. And I think the intended fear and tension of the zombie setting was captured in those combats, leading to a lot of positive experiences for my players. One of my players, the person who actually plays Santa Claus around Christmas in real life, they actually commented that they really enjoyed the thematic focus on the idea of finding hope that Jason Bulmahn wrote into Hopefinder, and they said that they really connected with the story as a result. And honestly, to me, that is high praise to the system, because having a player say that they really felt invested in the story of a one-shot game, I think that says a lot about how the game is structured, so that was a major compliment that I saw. As for my normal Pathfinder 2e group, again, I got pretty positive responses. Most of the people said they really enjoyed the game. There was one player who said that they were happy that they played it once, but they weren't particularly interested in returning to Hopefinder in the future. But another one of my regular players actually said that they love the idea of the game and would be very interested in doing a short campaign, the level 1 to level 5 that Hopefinder is designed for. That's something they would really want to see. Whether people wanted to stop at the one-shot or wanted to try a few more sessions of Hopefinder, the general impression across the board was pretty good, and while any attempt to dive into the reactions of high school students is invariably going to be met with my exasperated teacher face, my high school students also really enjoyed the experience, meaning that there is a very common positive play experience for each instance of me running this game. But now let's dive into my specific observations as someone who has run Hopefinder, and some of the things I think are worth noting if you're interested in trying this game. The first thing that I want to talk about is something that I predicted in my previous video that definitely came true. One of the mechanical changes from Pathfinder 2e to Hopefinder is that the idea of hero points have been replaced with a mechanic called hope. Hope is a mechanical reflection of the purpose that your character has found to keep going in the face of the zombie apocalypse. Hope can offer benefits similar to hero points in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, such as allowing you the opportunity to reroll a dice, but it also has a more significant narrative role, and most importantly, serves as a measure of how effectively your character can fight off the zombie plague should they be exposed to it. When I was doing my first read-through of Hopefinder, and in that first video I did on the game, the very idea of hope as a mechanic was something I found very compelling. Longtime viewers of this channel may be aware that I think hero points in Pathfinder 2nd Edition are a little too generic, and while I understand their place in the game, I definitely feel like they need a little bit more to be engaging. Well, hope is a fantastic example of how you can make the hero point mechanic more engaging to your stories. I think Jason Bulmahn knocked this out of the park, and the actual play experience with Hopefinder showed me that this was true. My players didn't just have floating dice rerolls, but they had this very real risk-reward. Is it worth risking rerolling this dice? I might end up being exposed to the zombie plague, and then it would be harder for me to fight it off. Every time one of my players had to decide whether or not to spend hope, they had to weigh some very important decisions inside the game, and it led to a much more interesting play experience. And one of my players from the high school TTRPG club, one of them came dangerously close to being a victim of the zombie plague as a result. I really think the hope mechanic in Hopefinder is a standout mechanic for the game, and even if you aren't interested in playing Hopefinder over a longer period of time, I definitely recommend checking the game out just to get some good ideas on how you might upgrade hero points. Seriously, it's a strong aspect of the game. That being said, having run Hopefinder 4 times, hope was a hard mechanic to remember to use. Now I'm saying this as a Pathfinder 2e storyteller. A common comment that exists around hero points is that they're kind of hard to remember to actually give to your players, and I definitely ran into that problem big time with Hopefinder. Hope is an important mechanic, and because it has a bigger narrative weight, remembering to give out hope is a lot more significant in this game than hero points are in Pathfinder 2e, which means the fact that I kept forgetting kind of caused my games to struggle. And later in the observations, I'm going to offer some suggestions for storytellers who want to run Hopefinder, how you can address this. But I will say, hope was very, very good, but I also struggled to remember to use it, and that did impair the game a little bit. That leads into my second observation about Hopefinder, which is that relative to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Hopefinder is a clunkier game. Now, I don't want to oversell this point. I don't think that Hopefinder is so clunky as to be unplayable, or even so clunky as to be a bad experience. I just want to say that if you are an experienced Pathfinder 2e player moving over to Hopefinder, you're going to struggle a little bit with some of the extra rules elements. There are several rules elements that are different in Hopefinder. So for example, armor can give you damage resistance, and then you have things like bruises and dings that you have to track. There are a number of relatively small changes in Hopefinder that, taken together, do cause the game to slow down a little bit as you try to adapt to them. Now, I do think if you were to run one of those Hopefinder mini-campaigns, the level 1 to 5 that the game is designed for, I think that after 3 or 4 sessions, the Game Master and players would get used to the nuances of this game, and some of that clunkiness would vanish once they did. But if you enjoy Pathfinder 2nd Edition for how smoothly the game runs, I am going to tell you that Hopefinder is a little bit bumpier. Now, with that being said, Hopefinder is a game where you're playing survivors in the zombie apocalypse rather than fantasy heroes going on crazy adventures. So in some ways, the grittier, bumpier rules actually serve the theme, but it is an experiential difference worth noting. Moving back in a positive direction, one of the observations I would like to make is Jason Bulmahn did a really good job designing a number of interesting and engaging types of monsters. In the story for Hopefinder, the Z-Plague started out in the pig population, mutated, transferred to a number of different animals, and then ultimately to the human population, meaning that the Z-Plague has infected a lot of things around the world, not just people but animals as well, and Jason Bulmahn has done a good job of offering a variety of different options for the zombies you might find in the game Hopefinder. I've already mentioned in my story descriptions about sending my players up against Zombie Santa, and I also had fun with a few of the other unique zombie types that were running around the mall in that particular story. And then for my Zombies at the High School game, I was able to turn one of the zombies very easily into a mascot zombie, and that was really fun as well. While Hopefinder is going to lack the kind of creature depth that you would expect from a game like Pathfinder 2e, for the scope that the game intends, it has a really good representation of different challenges and creatures and just problems that players might have to face. One of the great takeaways from running Hopefinder for 4 different tables is none of the zombies that my players actually encountered felt like a cut and paste of something that they had previously seen. I was always able to throw them up against something that was new, that was interesting, and that was creepy in all of the great ways you expect a Halloween game to be. So one of the good things about Hopefinder is there is some fantastic zombie design in this game. For my 4th observation, I want to talk a little bit about combat. In Hopefinder, armor is changed up a little bit. While armor can affect your armor class a little bit, its primary purpose is actually to absorb incoming damage. Most of the armor that your characters can wear inside of Hopefinder are going to come with a resistance rating, which tells you how much damage that the armor absorbs, and then it's going to note the types of damage that the armor resists. Mechanically, this is a little bit clunkier than Pathfinder 2e's approach to armor, but it's not too difficult to manage. However, it does have a pretty big impact on the experience of combat, mostly in the form of critical hits are brutal, normal hits are meh. Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. Most of the zombies that you're going to encounter, if they land a normal hit, they can deal some damage, but it's not going to be a lot of damage, and if your character is wearing almost any kind of armor, they're probably going to be resistant to that damage, meaning that your typical hit inside of Hopefinder is relatively small. Now, I did note in the previous video that Hopefinder characters are not nearly as tough as an equally leveled Pathfinder character would be, so at first glance you might think this would equal out, but the actual experience in play is, most of the time, if the zombie is attacking a character and it just lands a normal hit, it's actually more likely to damage the armor than the actual character, and if the character does get damaged, the damage is going to be relatively minor. Armor almost turns into a temporary hit point pool that your character has as a shell around them that the zombies try to work their way through, and mechanically that's okay, but the big difference comes when a critical hit lands. In most cases, that completely ignores armor, and in this game, critical hits feel brutal. Every single table had at least one fight where one character almost died because a zombie caught them off guard and landed a critical hit, and their health pool dropped like that. There were lots of moments of genuine panic when zombies came through with a really serious attack, and one of my players found themselves on their back foot with extremely low health in a life-threatening situation. The ultimate takeaway from this point is, I really liked how critical hits felt in this game. They feel a lot more impactful in Hopefinder than they do Pathfinder 2e, but the experience of general combat is a little less tense than I would like it to be, just because I feel like armor kind of feels like temporary hit points, and that removes some of the tension from the fight, but one good critical hit from a zombie can change that up very quickly. And I guess to add to this point really quickly, critical hits also feel really good for your players in this game because there's just a lot of stuff that has the deadly trait in Hopefinder. Weapons like most firearms and the machete, they come with a trait called deadly, which just simply means triple damage on a crit. And in a low hit point game where crits ignore armor, the deadly trait is just a standout option in this game. And there were a lot of clutch moments for my players where they landed a critical hit with a deadly weapon and it swung a battle very dramatically in their favor. So with that conversation about how critical hits and normal hits feel different in Hopefinder, I want to move on to observation number 5 and talk about another thing that was a real positive to the Hopefinder experience, which is stealth and detection feel a lot more critical in this game. I mentioned that there were several instances where one of my players was very nearly killed by a zombie, and it was a moment where a zombie caught them off guard in one fashion or another. Not noticing the zombie really put my players in a bad spot, and it made things like stealth and detection so much more critical to the play experience. It didn't take my players long to figure out that if they didn't notice the zombie, that put them in danger, and naturally, as a result, the further my players went in each story, the more paranoid they became about checking every corner, looking for every place a zombie might be hiding, because they never knew where the next threat might come from. If you think about the armor class penalty that comes from being flat-footed, it's easy to realize catching someone off guard makes you more likely to land a critical hit, and in Hopefinder, critical hits are a lot more deadly. This has the distinct impact of making stealth, detection, checking every corner, watching your back, knowing where the enemies are or where the enemies might come from, a very important part of this game, and it lends itself really well to the zombie survival style of the narrative. While normal combat may feel a little bit slow compared to Pathfinder 2e, the overall dynamic of prepared players holding their own against the zombies, while unprepared players get absolutely wrecked by zombies, feels like the right dynamic that this game should have. So overall, I do think that combat ends up in a good place as a result. The last thing that I want to talk about is a piece of advice I have if you're a storyteller who wants to tell Hopefinder games, because I think you can structure a Hopefinder game a certain way to make it easier to tell. You may remember earlier that I mentioned that hope is very important mechanically, but kind of like hero points, it can be hard to remember. Well, after my experience running the class reunion story for 3 different tables, when I did my Black Friday special story, I switched it up a little bit, and it did make it easier to manage. I used an adventure design of a main mission and a bonus mission. I gave my players a main mission that they needed to accomplish as they were heading into the Pinecrest Mall setting, but then I also gave them a pair of bonus objectives that they could try and achieve as they made their way through the mall. And what I did is I specifically tied bonus hope to those bonus objectives. If they completed a bonus objective, then each member of the group would be awarded an extra point of hope. I think this worked really well, and if you follow this structure with your adventure design, you can actually offload some of the management of the game to your players by basically saying, here is your main mission, this is what you've got to do, but here are some of the bonus objectives, and if you complete a bonus objective, then you will get some extra hope that might help you with the main mission that you're going on. For a game like Pathfinder, having distinct main missions and bonus objectives could get stale pretty quickly, but for a game like Hopefinder that focuses on shorter campaigns, I think this particular approach to adventure design is a natural fit to this style of game, and if you structure your game this way, it makes it a lot easier to remember to pass out that hope, which in turn rewards your players for engaging with the story. So if you are a storyteller who is interested in running some Hopefinder, I do recommend that main objective, bonus objective design structure, at least when you're starting Hopefinder, because I think that will make it easier for you to manage in the course of play. But that's the last of the observations I have from my experience running several Hopefinder one-shots, so the time has come again to turn the conversation over to you. Do you have any further questions about Hopefinder? Or have you had the chance to play the game, and do you have any suggestions yourself? I would love to hear your observations, thoughts, and questions, so jump down to the comment section and let me know what you think. And along the way, don't forget all of that other YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe, check out my free Discord and my Patreon. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.